job to remind me, Zoe.
Well, yeah, I totally have it under control. Record. Oh wait, could you give me permission?
It's
Sorry,
okay.
co-host.
I'm recording. No worries. Okay. Sorry. Last
Okay,
week,
thanks.
everybody at iZone semi forgot to record, so people started drawing on their arms, just like the record button, so we would remember. Okay. All right, I'm going to start right ahead then. So last week we did our shoe design experiments. Everybody split into teams and they designed a shoe for a person in that team. So today I want to start briefly, like 5-10 minutes, talk a little bit about what that experiment was and what design thinking is. Like I mentioned, we're going to very deeply go into design thinking for the last 2 weeks of this course. This was just a very brief introduction so we can start connecting some ideas to community engagement. So I just want to go over some of these questions. You can shout out your answer and also drop comments in the chat about any of these. So for those of you that were in the shoe design experiment last week, and even if you haven't, but you've seen the recording, etc., feel free to comment. So first question was, we started with splitting into teams, and then I asked everybody to come up with questions to ask their partners. So the first question is, was it a challenge to figure out which questions to ask your user at the beginning? And why do you think we picked the questions we were going to ask?
I found it challenging because number one, I realized after the fact that we were supposed to pick 5 questions, I think. We definitely didn't pick 5 questions. I found it challenging because number one, I found it challenging to be asking about somebody else's, like designing for a user for someone else. I found that challenging in and of itself. And then I don't know, I don't feel like it was such a new skill for me that I don't feel like I asked the best questions. So I feel like I want to do it again to get better.
Okay, that's wonderful. And we're definitely going to do this again multiple times. So that's really good. Thank you. Anybody else have any comments about that? Why was it challenging to figure out what to ask your user?
Well, I think it's also kind of that we assume that the person wants the exact same needs as us, so we tend to ask fewer questions regarding individualizing the shoes, when in reality that's what you should be doing.
Okay, that's really good, Madawan. Thank you. So one challenge that comes with asking, like finding the right question to ask, is because we have our own preconditioned ideas about what the needs and wants of a person or a group may be. So it's hard to really find the right questions to ask to break those preconditioned ideas and find the actual problem, like the cause, or find the actual need of a person. So it's really important to frame a question or frame what you're asking to a person to understand their needs, so your own ideas and wants don't get in the way of that. So definitely that's a great feedback. We'll connect that to the second question. So my question was, what was interesting about designing for one person's needs and wants?
I didn't realize it until Joey, oh yeah.
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Thanks. I didn't realize it until Joey asked, he was in our group for a bit and he asked I'm just having a hard time remembering this guy's name. Habitamu, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Habitamu. He asked Habitamu, he asked a question in a way that really put you know, Habitamu's vision or what Habitamu would like the shoe to be like. He asked the questions in a way that like that was first, and you know, it was very open-ended, so Habitamu could develop something, you know, like giving him space to develop some ideas that he might want. And I was asking a lot of yes no questions, and like at that moment then I realized what's really interesting about it was then that becomes like a total, like a map for you to interact with, but you also need to like let them form. It's really interesting.
Okay, that's also great feedback. So a lot of the times it's hard to find the right question to ask that would get a person to open up. We talked about that during the active listening as well. Like we need to be prompting people to ask why, to get to the cause of a problem, to get to the cause of a core of an idea. And sometimes it's difficult because we ask questions that are more superficial that would get us like quicker answers. Like one of the challenges of a shoe design could be that rather than asking about like, what will you use the shoe for, or like what's your background, what do you do in a day, where does your shoes go with you, you know, like that would get a person to explain more of their life and gets you to understand more of their experience with the shoe. Sometimes the first questions that come to mind are like, what color do you want the shoe to be, or what's your favorite shoe, like right now what does it look like in terms of design. And those are simpler questions that get you simpler answers. So sometimes we frame things and say you only have 5 questions, because if we ask all of these simpler questions before, then we're going to start losing those more deeper questions. So sometimes it's important to figure out like, what can I ask that will get me more a deeper understanding from the other person. And that's sort of what we try to do with the active listening as well. And that's sort of what I'm trying to emphasize with all of these stuff that we're starting with, is listening and finding the right questions to ask that will get you the right answers you're looking for is one of the most important steps to design, to community engagement, to any sort of impact you want to make. So that was definitely wonderful, Paige. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here is the other question. I'll sort of wrap this into one. This says, how did you get feedback from the person you were designing for? And the second one says, how did you involve the person you're designing for in your sketch and prototyping process? So the general question is, why was it valuable to involve your user in your design process? What did you get out of it that otherwise you wouldn't get? Let's say you were designing the shoe for Habitamu. What would be different if he wasn't in the group with you telling you what he needs or wants?
I think I've seen from the pictures posted on Slack that people want different things because they're doing different things. Like I saw the design for a shoe that doubles a shoe that for roller skates and ice skates that Grayson drew, and I I don't know whose group Grayson was in, but it just looked really different from mine. So I think depending on the person, you could get totally different designs for what your shoe was gonna be.
Definitely. And let me ask it this way, Madawan. You were designing for Susan. How would a shoe designed for Susan look like if Susan wasn't there to tell you what she wants or needs?
Uh, we'd just be working off of assumptions. Like if we'd just be working off getting a profile of what Susan does. Like we might find that she's interested in track and field, but we won't be able to. But we won't be able to do any of that other stuff. Like we won't be able to. We won't be able to know that Susan supports environmentally friendly causes, environmentally friendly shoes, sustainable work.
Exactly. Thank you. Like basically, if you were designing for Susan without Susan, it would be your ideas going into the work and not really hers, and it wouldn't necessarily match exactly what she needs, right? And that's sort of what we say when we mean human-centered or community-centered design. is to make sure our assumptions don't get in the way of solving a problem or designing the actual right fit for a situation. Thank you.
And
Yes, please.
if I could add something real quick with like the getting feedback on the prototype thing, is that sometimes people aren't able to articulate what they want, or sometimes you miss asking questions, or they don't think about stuff, or sometimes you misinterpret what they give you. So maybe your prototype is not what they're necessarily thinking of. So getting the feedback is important because you don't necessarily understand or have all the information just from asking the questions the first time.
Yep, that's also really wonderful feedback. Yeah, Bertha says assumptions are not a good strategy. Definitely one of the biggest things we're talking about, whether it comes to design or community engagement, is we need to figure out a way to break our assumptions so we know exactly what the impact we want to make is, what the need in a community is, and that comes from asking the right questions, really listening to people and actively engaging before you start putting in new ideas. So definitely, like Grayson, also I agree, like it doesn't just happen at the beginning. You need to constantly go back and ask, because you make your draft based on what your partner said, but then there's more ideas building on that draft. There's more ideas that get added to the prototype because things develop together. So it's definitely important to keep the person, the user, the community partner involved at every step. And then I'll ask this last question really fast. How is this process that we did the shoe design experiment? How does that align with stages of design thinking that you've seen from the YouTube videos last week? You watched the 5 stages of design thinking, the short videos. How do you see those reflecting in the shoe design experiment?
Well, one is empathize.
Yes.
I mean, I know. I kind of can relate to Susan doing track and field because my brother does track and field. So I think that kind of empathy is what factored into the design of the shoe.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I mean, we definitely did the prototyping and testing with the prototyping with like drawing the shoe, and then the testing with the like showing the person who we're making the shoe for and getting the feedback on the prototype.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we couldn't do this in person. If we were able to, we would have done the sketch in like pen and paper, but then we would have done the prototype with like physical materials, cardboard, sponges, like all kinds of stuff. So you would have had the second physical aspect. But because it's online, we went with more of drawing. But that's also another way you can prototype. You can actually make stuff out of junk and test out how it will feel and look. So thank you. Any other last words, any insight or feedback you have about the shoe design experiment? After that, we're going to move on to our presentations.
I was thinking there's something really, it seems like a useless dimension to acknowledge, but in some way it's really not, that this is really a service-oriented thinking process.
I don't think that's
occurred to me.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very useful. Like, this is a very service-oriented, very user-oriented. We're like, everything design thinking stands for is about figuring out what your user wants or need, not what you want to provide. So it's definitely more service-oriented, you can say. Thank you.
But I like that helps, like then it really helps, it's helping. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful feedback. That was a little bit of reflecting, and you can feel free to continue doing that as we keep going. I'm going to move forward, starting with today's presentations. Everybody was assigned chapter 1 and 2, and then I split you into groups to talk about some of these themes we've been seeing in the readings, because these are really valuable, especially We will use all of these themes, concepts, definitions from today when we're doing our reflections on Wednesday on the documentary that we're going to watch between those 2 days. So today, feel free to take notes as people are presenting, and hopefully share your presentation with us on Slack afterwards so everybody has access to everyone's presentations. So I'll jump right into it. I'll stop share. We'll go in group order. So group 1, you're talking about concepts of community. Everybody, please keep your presentations to about 5 minutes, and then you'll have about 3 to 5 minutes to ask people questions, have a small discussion, reflect, and hopefully we'll finish on time. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing so you guys can go ahead.
Awesome. So our topic was community engagement. So what is community? It can be described and defined in many different ways, but 4 useful ones for this context are systemic, social, virtual, and individual community. Systemic community is how different parts of a community have unique functions, needs, and interests. In a healthy community, all components work together. Social community is how different people in the community relate to each other, to community organizations and leaders. Virtual community is social groups with shared interests interacting in virtual space and can be just as strong as communities in neat space. And then individual community is just how people identify with the communities that they're parts of. And acknowledging individuals' connections to their communities is essential to understanding the communities as a whole.
So, what is community engagement? So, the textbook defines community engagement as this really long paragraph right here, so we're going to break it down real quick. So, community engagement is working collaboratively, so problems shouldn't be limited or just be worked with you alone. You have to work with others. Likewise, if you see a problem that you spot but doesn't apply to others, that's not community engagement either. So they're affiliated by geographic proximity, special interest, or civil situations. And as I stated before, empathizing is one of the main aspects of the design process. So that's where the design thinking process is gonna come into community engagement. And then it's a powerful vehicle for bringing about environmental and behavioral changes. So the solution needs to be beneficial in the long run. Any short-term solution is not community engagement. It's just a temporary fix for a everlasting problem. Involves partnerships and coalitions, and they serve as catalysts for changing policies, programs, and practices. So we're just going to touch on this a little bit in the discussion, but the means that full use of resources and communities are required include community services and healthcare. And in order to help create more effective policies, you have to invest more in communities.
You can kind of look at community engagement as unfolding on a continuum. So as it says at the top of this slide, obviously, increasing level of community involvement, impact, trust, and communication flow. You see at the top of each of these columns here, we have 5 forms or kinds of community involvement / engagement: outreach, consult, involve, collaborate, and shared leadership. On the next slide, I'm gonna go into this more. So here on the x-axis, we have those 5. And then on the y-axis, we just have the level of community involvement. So that's basically how deep you're getting in. And as you can see, outreach is good. It's some, but it's not the most. And then we go up, and that's pretty obvious, you can see. And we end with this strong 2-way relationship And in the thing, they say that any kind of interaction, like a one-time encounter, is, you know, even if it starts down here at just outreach, it's likely, if you're having this mentality, that they're going to go up this continuum in some way and evolve in other ways. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about how this happens. So they go into this this really interesting approach from different directions in the chart that's in the reading, but here I decided to highlight what seems to be the main driver of this changing relationship. If you look at the inner circle, outreach, you can see it just ends in an arrow. That's only going from this left circle on the left. We have the community engagement practitioner, the outreach initiator, the person who is looking to get this process going. Basically, it'd be us, since we're learning how to practice community engagement. And we see that the outreach arrow just goes to the community, and they're just giving the community information. Now, the next one, consult, that's kind of the orangish one. We see it goes to community through, we see that community at the bottom goes back. They're giving back, they're giving feedback. So if you think, what is consulting? That's two ways, you know? You give someone some information, they tell you what's going on with them. So then communication continues to evolve, and in the involve circle, we see that now both parties are participating on issues. And I put more arrows here, it's just vague kind of, but to show that, you know, now they're cooperating. And another thing that it's not shown here, but it's not just that they're talking now, they're starting to collaborate on some things. And as you can, oh, that leads nicely to the next circle. That's collaborate. Now we're actually working on projects. So we started out just one person talking to another, and now, or one entity really, and now you can see by the two arrows, the strength of this has increased a lot. They're communicating frequently, which makes it into kind of these bi-directional communication channels. And now a partnership is forming, ending in shared leadership. So basically they talk all the time, they make decisions together, and this basically creates an extra entity, which is their partnership. And there are lots of benefits to this, as we'll see in the next part.
Okay, speed through this. There are like 9 specific positive impacts of community engagement. I'm just going to highlight a few. Design, delivery, and implementation and change are sort of related in that involving the community in projects and asking questions allows for a more accurate picture of a situation and increases the speed of research and change. And then involving the public in a project is when researchers work with people rather than like treating them as subjects. They can recognize the contributions of the people in the community, and it's more fair to the people involved and makes people more willing to participate and assist the researchers.
Okay, so now for the discussion. So there's recently been a push in the United States to shift public funding from law enforcement to healthcare, education, and other institutions that support communities. Based on the concept of community engagement, how do you think this might change the social systems of the U.S.?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So, camera, what? Okay, so there has recently been a push in the United States so there's a movement called defund the police, which doesn't mean take away, it doesn't mean cut funds from the police entirely. It's just allocate more funds from the police to more community-centered services like healthcare, education, and other institutions that support communities. So, based on the concept of community engagement, how do you think this might change the social system of the U.S.?
And do you want us to answer this in a few minutes? Because we can talk a whole week.
Okay. Okay, 1 minute response. Short answer.
I could try to answer that briefly.
Okay, sure.
I would say that in identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the institutions that you mentioned,
Yeah.
a really important way to base a solution off of community engagement is to identify those social systems and their strengths. For example, social work is a really important system in this concept that might need to be used to de-escalate situations with some people, when you get a 911 call that may not be, where police may not be needed. So that could be an example of one, identifying one strength and using that strength in a way that would fill in for a weakness in a different system or sector, I guess.
Okay, very good. So, what are some of the ways people involved in higher education, and as us students, faculty, or staff, what are some of the ways that we can participate in community engagements?
That's a great question. And I actually think group 2 or 3 is going to answer this because they're going to talk about different forms of community engagement. But one of them is definitely taking classes that are community engaged. There's a lot of classes in University of Rochester that do community engagement with various partners around Rochester. You can participate in community-based participatory research, or you can do ethnographic research. Actually, I think someone here does that. They mentioned in the exit tickets. Another one is volunteering, spending time helping out in various organizations around Rochester or anywhere. I'd say there's a lot of ways you can get involved, either academically or personally. But one of them is just to simply just reach out to people and say, hey, I want to come and volunteer, or hey, I want to spend a day at your organization. I want to know more about what you're doing. It's always important to just reach out without expectations. But there's a lot of stuff, and I'd be happy to provide some like lists of classes and things you can do in Rochester, specifically for those of you that are in UofR.
Okay, that's it.
All right, thank you so much. When you stop sharing, group 2 can go ahead. I think group 2 is Bertha, Habitamu, and Elena.
Can all see my screen?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So hello everyone. Before moving with other definitions, I'm going to start with culture. And according to Christopher Kiefer, culture is a complex, integrated system of thought and behavior shaped by members of a group, a system whose whole pattern allows us to understand the meanings that people attach to specific facts and observations. So culture really shapes our identities. It constructs the bridges between the members of the communities, and it creates the meanings of the community's existence. So I think to understand the community engagement, we first need to understand what culture is, and just like culture, communities are also diverse and dynamic. They are not homogeneous, and they are made up of diverse groups with different histories, social structures, different social structures, different value systems, and different cultural understandings of the world. And to really understand why a community exists and to gain a meaning-centered approach towards a community, we really need to recognize an individual's own culture and how it builds up one's belief systems and identity. So going on with the community organization, community organizing is based on the principles of empowerment, community competence, active participation, and starting where the people are. It's the key practice to bring people together to take action towards the shared beliefs and concerns inside the community. And since we are social animals, we depend on each other, and to make an actual difference, we need to be involved in the process itself altogether in order to change. We all must feel a need for change. Moving with community participation, meaningful community participation extends beyond physical involvement to include generation of ideas, contributions to decision making, and sharing of responsibility. People can be involved and participate in a community with different motivations, like opportunities for networking, access to information and resources, learning, improved relationships among stakeholders, and so on. But the important criteria here when one is thinking about being a participant in a community is that if the benefit outweighs the costs, like time and energy required to be involved in the community. And as a last part for myself, to develop constituency in the communities, there are 4 elements: knowing the community and its capabilities, establishing strategies that guides interactions, building and sustaining formal and informal networks to maintain relationships, and mobilizing communities and constituencies for decision-making and social action.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about capacity building of community engagement, which is a process when individuals and also organizations can improve their skills, their knowledge, some tools, everything that they need to do their jobs better. Also allow individuals and organizations to perform better, a greater capacity. So they can use support, they can use learning, teaching, knowledge, coaching, skills, and more developed to the community building. What is the next slide? Okay. Specifically, what is community empowerment? So this refers to the process that able communities to increase control over their lives. And specifically, empowerment refers to the process by which everyone get control over some decisions or some factors that we can shape our own lives. And finally, the coalition building is when we talk about the process in which individuals, organizations, nations, they come together to form a coalition to implement more community engagement. Does anybody have a question?
That was very well put. Thank you so much. I definitely would love a copy of this presentation. Do you guys prepare any discussion questions, or would you like us to ask something?
Actually, we haven't prepared. I mean, Bertha, do you have any questions for the folks? I think a question pops into my head, but I'm not sure if it's related. I mean, to involve in a community it seems easier for me than to sustain my place in the community. And I wonder, what are your motivations to keep going with the same community? I'm not sure if it's related, but.
No, that's a really good question. Grayson, do you want to answer?
I was going to ask if you could write that in the chat.
Yeah, sure, I might.
Okay. Meanwhile, does anybody want to answer, or I can also take a go? Okay, so Elena is asking, like, she understands the motivation to start an engagement, but what's the motivation for sustaining an engagement with the same partner or the same community? And I think that's a really good question. And actually, we're going to talk about that on Wednesday, because the documentaries you're going to watch are about people who are engaged with communities long term. I would say, like, on a personal note, the reason why I find the motivation is because I believe in the problem that the community is trying to solve or the community is impacted by. That's why in the description of the course, I said we're going to explore problems that break our hearts and communities that we connect with that have a place in our hearts. And that doesn't always have to come from like a personal experience or background, but something that really you feel personally connected to, passionate about, whether it be the people or the problem that they're facing. If it breaks your heart, if it keeps you up at night, I would say that's the motivation to keep you going. And it's important to figure out what exactly it is for you personally that you would want to invest in, because that's the motivation that keeps you going, that personal attachment and that passion and the commitment you have to the people. And there's always so many problems in the world, and we feel like all of them are important, but we don't have the capacity as one individual to solve all of them. So it's important to find the one that you feel like you connect the most with, and that's the motivation that keeps you going, I would say. And if anybody has any other things, personal experience, etc., feel free to add in.
Well, I was thinking about coalitional building to promote community engagement. We talk about, as individuals and also organizations like UFR, but I'm thinking, how can you, or who is the person, well, I should say, I think I know the answer. Who is gonna be the person to do a nation coalition building? Like in a nation, who is gonna be the person besides the president? Who else can be a person who can structure coalition building?
So I don't know if this answers that question specifically, but a club I've been part of recently has been working with somebody who works for a nonprofit that works on anti-racism stuff. And we were having a discussion the other day and talking about how like activism and stuff has changed, and like how the civil rights movement and like social justice movements like back in the 60s, 70s, whatever, had specific leaders. So like you had Martin Luther King, you had Malcolm X, you had like in the feminism movement, you had like specific people. But a lot of like what we're seeing today, you don't as much have like those specific people that you're pointing to and being like, those are the leaders of the movement. That there might be like locally like leaders of movements, but like on a national level, you don't be like, okay, these are the people who are the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, or these are the people who are the leaders of the people who are working for LGBTQ plus rights. It's more decentralized. And that also makes it harder for people to like attack, because they can't just like take out the leaders and bring everything crashing down, if that makes sense.
In Turkish, we have a very specific word for this, but in English, I think it translates as to organize. Aleyna, örgütlenmek for you in Turkish. But basically, what it means is to organize around a cause, whether it's centralized or decentralized. And I think the trend has shifted. Like back in the day, people connected to a figure, and that's how they organized around an issue. And in today's world where news are traveling so fast, people are being impacted by so many things at once. People are coming together around more decentralized concepts like marketing or like social media things or rallies or like just concepts like Black Lives Matter is a movement. It's not a person. It's not represented by a person. And that's changing because of how we are receiving and sending information into the world in the current day. But I would definitely say it makes it into a different challenge to organize and to like be involved in a community because it doesn't have a figure, it doesn't have a representative. But I say that's just a different approach, but definitely a good like difference to emphasize. Okay. Theo, are you back?
I'm back, but
Okay.
I'm calling from my phone actually. So
Okay. Technically, you, Alicia, and UA were group 3, but do you feel okay to talk about it if you can't screen share?
yeah, I might try joining from my laptop again so I can just share, or
Okay.
maybe I could send it. I could send it to you and.
Yeah, I can do that. I can screen
Okay.
share.
Oh.
If you're having connection issues, oh, okay, there you go, actually,
It's
never
good
mind.
now.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that sharing okay?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Okay, so our group was the models for the practice of community engagement, and I think this was pages 20 to 25 in the link you sent us. And so we first have to look at the social ecological model where we have 4 different levels. So we'll start out with the individual, and that's basically the personal qualities, your age, where you went to school, how much money you make, and then if we go one step beyond that, we have our intimate relationships with family, peers, with a partner, or other individual connections, general friends. And then we can go even further up to the community, which is your small neighborhoods, your school groups, maybe your workplace circles, and just the social circles that extend beyond like 2 people but are still somewhat intimate. And then we go up to societal, which could be anything from a city to a campus to a country. So there's a range with that to consider. And if we're tackling social problems, we have to consider these, and all of these are how we create the sustainable change needed. And then Everett Roger, he created some diffusion stages. So first off, we have to have the knowledge, and we can expose ourselves to that initially, and then add persuasion. We're seeking out information proactively. We're curious. We're trying to investigate, and then we weigh the advantages and disadvantages and how we really see this going into fruition. So that's our decision phase. And implementation is where, okay, we know our stakeholders, we know the upsides and downsides, let's actually implement this. And confirmation is, maybe we have some information as to how our idea played out. We've had some execution. Now, how do we continue that in the future? And then a community-based participatory research is an approach that involves collective, reflective, and systematic inquiry in how we can engage as equal partners among the research process, and how we can educate ourselves and educate others about actually bringing out the social change.
Thank you, Theo. Do you have any questions or discussion prompts you'd like us to respond to?
I don't think our group got to those. We could have coordinated better, but yeah, we'll have questions.
That's okay. Could you stop on the example slide, the third one?
Yeah.
So here, this is about the social ecological model where there's 4 steps: individual, relationship, community, and society. And this is basically talking about how like problems like racism, human rights, childhood obesity, etc., any problem is perceived differently at different levels of a community. It's perceived and impacts differently each individual, in which case every individual sort of gets influenced by the problem differently. And then on a relationship level, like you can imagine, we talked about stakeholders briefly. There are different stakeholders in childhood obesity. There's the child, there are the parents, there's the school, where the cafeteria where the child eats food. And based on how an individual or a community experiences this problem, it also changes the relationships between all of these different stakeholders. So the social ecological model is just basically saying, when you are considering a problem, think about all of the stakeholders, think about individuals, think about communities, and think about relationships in between these people, and consider how they will change, how they will be impacted, and where would be the best point to insert yourself to fix the situation. Because it could be an individual, it could be on a community level. Like if you're doing something on a society level, it's more like lawmaking or policy. If you're doing something on an individual level, it's literally one-on-one. So this is a framework to encourage people who are working with these situations to consider where would be the best situation to put yourself in and to start understanding and solving this problem. And it's a really good method to consider all of the different people involved in a situation. And the community-based participatory research. Oh, that's okay, Bertha. Thank you so much for joining all the way from your car. Bertha might just have to leave soon, so. Okay, as I was saying, I just wanted to emphasize that with Theo's example. So thank you so much, Theo, for sharing these stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any input, or we're gonna move on to Susan? Okay, actually, so unfortunately, there is nobody here from group 4, which is chapter 2. We were gonna talk about the principles of community engagement. So Susan has 5 to 9. I think I'm just gonna really quickly just name out the first 4 since the group isn't here. Laquanda couldn't make it today. So all of this was chapter 1. These were concepts and themes around community engagement. And then chapter 2 is literally 9 principles that should be followed when you're doing community engagement. Some of them are really straightforward. Some of them are a bit trickier. I hope everybody actually read both of these chapters. They're very, very important. I'm going to just name them out because the group isn't here. So number 1, the first principle is be clear about the purposes or goals of the engagement effort and the populations and or communities you want to engage. So the very first group talked about what a community is, how a community is defined, and what community engagement is. And the reason we define community is because when you are trying to find your stakeholders, you're trying to understand who a problem has impacted, you need to be able to define the community that is being impacted, and that can change whether on an individual level, on a societal level, a community changes from the perspective you look at it. So the very first thing is be very clear about your purposes and about the communities you want to engage, because you don't want to leave out any community that's impacted by a situation. If you're talking about water rights, you don't want to just talk to one side of the river. You want to make sure you're including the other side of the river too. So it's important to identify who's there and who is impacted. So that's number 1. Number 2, this is very straightforward. Become knowledgeable about the community's culture, economic conditions, social networks, political power structures, norms and values, demographic trends, history and experience with efforts by outside groups to engage it in various programs. I'll give an example because I'm an archaeology major. When you're engaging with indigenous communities, Native American communities, you need to understand their norms and values, their communities, cultures, structure, so that you're not coming in as a white savior, so that you're respecting other people's community structures and cultures. And it's also important to understand what happened before you came in, what other groups tried to like engage with this community, because sometimes people have bad experiences, something other groups done have impacted them negatively, so they don't want to talk to you or they don't want you to do a similar practice. So it's important to know all about history, culture, and norms. That's number 2. Number 3, it says for engagement to occur, it's necessary to go to the community, establish relationships, build trust, work with formal and informal leadership, and seek commitment from community organizations. Grayson was just saying, like here it says formal and informal leadership. Grayson was saying sometimes there's a person and a face, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's important to understand those informal relationship, like leadership structures too. This one is straightforward. We've been saying this about active listening, about empathy. You go and establish relationships first. You build trust first before you try to embed any solutions or ideas, so that you understand the need. And then number 4 is remember and accept that collective self-determination is the responsibility and right of all people in a community. No external entity should assume it can bestow on a community the power to act in its own self-interest. I'm going to say this very straightforward. This basically says, don't be a white savior. Don't assume your ideas are ideas that people want to implement. Even if you think your solution is perfect, a community might not want to use it at all, and you can't force them to. So respect that a community has collective self-determination. They can choose what's right for them, and you don't have a say in that particularly. And that's a very important one, I think, is to remember that at the end, you are not above a community, you are a part of a community. So it's important to respect the collective decision-making process. I'm gonna end right here so Susan can talk about the rest of the principles, but those were the first 4. Go ahead, Susan.
Okay. All right, so first of all, I'm going to praise all of you who did presentations because yours were really nice and didn't have a lot of words on the slides and had pictures, and mine do not, but that's okay. It gets the point across. So I focused, like Dennis said, on chapter 2 and the principles 5 through 9. So on each slide, I do have the actual principle copied right from the textbook. So I'll go over those and then talk about more about. I apologize because someone's mowing the lawn right outside of my window. So all aspects must recognize. Oh, sorry, that's. I'm starting. Okay, here. Partnering with the community is necessary to create change and improve health. So first they define a partnership, which is mutual cooperation and responsibility amongst party members who are acting on community engagement. And any of those parties can be individuals, they can be organizations or other community members. An equitable community partnership and discussion of power lead to positive change. So whenever a community can have very transparent discussions of power and identify who has power in a community, it's more likely that positive change can be implemented. So take the example of health research. Community participation enhances the potential of research. So research is not as effective on health if the community isn't participating, and if everyone who has greater strengths aren't taking leadership in that initiative. So every party holds responsibilities for the outcome of an effort. So that just means that whoever is working towards a certain effort is responsible in the outcome and the final kind of effect of that effort. And then I took this quote right from the textbook, that the individuals and groups involved in a partnership must identify opportunities for co-learning and feel that they each have something meaningful to contribute. So a key aspect of all of these principles is that we should identify strengths of people, and I'll talk about that more in the next slides, in people that are involved in community engagement, and really hone in on those strengths in order to create something that is collaborative, that can lead to the solution that you're looking for. So all aspects must recognize and represent and respect the diversity of the community in community engagement. An awareness of various cultures of community and factors affecting diversity are paramount in planning, designing, and implementing approaches to engaging a community. So this principle just, as you can tell, kind of focuses on diversity and how it can be used in a helpful sense and in a really important sense in working towards the solution in a community. So they define the like diversity as it can be economic, diversity, educational, employment, health status, as well as differences in culture, language, race, ethnicity, age, gender, mobility, literacy, or personal interests. And all of these factors affects like access to healthcare and health and ability to engage. So that's kind of one example, going back to the healthcare or working towards like a healthcare or healthcare research. That is an example of how all of those factors might affect that effort. So they also define something called the systems perspective, which is that there are a range of roles played by people and organizations in a community. So that could be that, like, as an individual, you are playing the role of maybe just you. You're only representing yourself, but you're volunteering for an organization to help something in the community. So that's kind of an example of that. And based off of this, you must then use multiple engagement strategies because people have different roles. Okay, so principle 7 says that community engagement can only be sustained by identifying and mobilizing community assets and strengths by developing the community's capacity and resources to make decisions and take action. So community assets are defined by the textbook as interests, skills, and experiences of individuals and local organizations, as well as the networks of relationships that connect them. And exchange of resources among facilities, skills, materials, and economic power can lead to the most positive change. So really honing in, like I said before, on people's or organizations' skills and kind of resources that they have in the community can really help build an effective team or organization of people working towards a certain goal. So another point that they really emphasized is that you can only begin with existing resources. So things that you already have access to, for instance, or knowledge that you already have. You can only begin with those. But developing new resources and skills is what makes you able to sustain engagement. So it kind of talks about how time, and I'll elaborate this more on the next slide, time is really important when it comes to community engagement, because you need to be able to develop new resources, new skills, new knowledge when you you strive for an effective solution. So engaging community to take action on health will develop capacity and infrastructure. So again, using the example of health, if you engage people and educate people on health and what the problems that the community is experiencing in health can really help develop capacity and infrastructure. So that might mean that there are more educational resources as people become more involved in the mission statement of health in that community. Principle 8 says that organizations that wish to engage A community, as well as individuals seeking to effect change, must be prepared to release control of actions or interventions to the community and be flexible enough to meet its changing needs. So that's kind of what Dennis just talked about in the fourth principle, that you really can't like fight for an organization or a cause as an individual. You need to release your control of the actions and interventions to the community, because you're trying to engage as a community and not just as an individual. So community action must be sustainable and a manageable process for people to participate in. And if it's not a manageable process for people to participate in, you're gonna lose engagement and you're gonna lose people that are going to be able to act. And it must be sustainable. So people must be able to continue their action and continue their support. And you need to make it like available to people for people to do that. So there's dynamicism and constant change when you're.
Susan? So sorry, but you're gonna have to speed up just a little bit.
Okay, that's fine. So new alliances and networks are formed, and there will need to be relationship changes in institutions and individuals, and implementing efforts to engage a community. You must be prepared for changes in those institutions and individuals. And then finally, principle 9 is that community collaboration requires long-term commitment by engaging organizations and its partners. So time is really key in this, that you have to have time to build trust and improve infrastructure and community action. And then I do have a few questions for you guys. So why is sustainable action key in community engagement? And what is a meaningful partnership?
I think I just accidentally answered number 1. I just said building trust and relationships take time. That's why sustainable action is key in a community, key in community engagement too, because you need to be able to build that trust, and that takes time. And if you are only doing something that's a one-off, like you go and build a well somewhere and then you leave, that's service, that's transactional, not transformational. So it's important for community engagement to be sustainable, because you want the act of engaging to transform you and your partner, and the impact should be long lasting. So I'll explain this next week, like next session too, but we call these concepts transactional versus transformational engagement. If it's transactional, it's a one-off. You're giving something, they're receiving something, and that's not sustainable, that's not engaging, that's a service. Versus transformational, you are putting in work, efforts, you're putting in yourself, and it's changing you as a result of co-learning and growing. So it's important that it's sustainable. So that's a good question. Thank you, Susan.
Do I have time to ask any more questions, or should that be it for right now?
Maybe ask one more and somebody else can go, and then we'll wrap up right away.
Okay. How does diversity of engaged partners help with creating change?
Basically, like, different people come from different places and have different knowledge and different perspectives. So, like, if you just have one person or one group of people or one perspective working on something, then you're not going to get, like, the widest possible range of ideas and solutions.
Theo also answered your question. Thank you, Paige. Yeah, you can, everybody can leave. I was just going to say, I'm going to put everything in Slack for Wednesday. So please read Slack and send your presentations, and everybody can go. This lasted a bit longer, I'm sorry. But all of your discussion questions you've been using, we're going to continue using them next session. So Susan will definitely talk more about the rest of your discussion questions too. Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you, Susan. We can finish right here. Go, people.